Welcome to this video about KNOBI, a new utility module by Jolin Lab. KNOBI can do a few things for us, but well, I think its main focus is mixing and attenuverting signals. There's ways to add offset to your sound, and there's generous amounts of amplification in here as well. If you come into this video thinking that this giant knob here sets the amount of offset for whatever you send in, you're somewhat mistaken. But let me run you through the features and what all the settings do. And I'm sure at the end of the explanation, you will be able to make sense of what's going on here. First of all, there's 4 inputs. You can send any kind of signal in there, audio and CV, both positive, negative or bipolar signals. There's an output called the reference output. This output just always sends out 5 volts. So if you keep in mind that one of these squares on the scope represents 5 volts, you can see that this is indeed the case. There's 4 outputs. These are kind of cascaded or stacked multiples. And these are similar to how the signals in Agogo are stacked. So the first output just gives us whatever is happening here. But if you leave this unpatched and you use the second output, these 2 channels, well, they are normalized together, but they get stacked as well. That's why I call these stacked multiples. And the result is that this signal is twice as loud or has twice the amplitude as the first one. If you leave this one unpatched as well and you use the third one, the first 3 outputs are stacked and you get a signal that's, well, 3 times the amplitude, and well, the fourth one, if you don't use any of the ones above, is an output with 4 times the amplitude of what we are getting out of this one. Now, well, should you, for example, use the second output, which gives us a signal with twice the amplitude of the first output, then the third output is just a regular times 1. So wherever you patch something up, this breaks the stacking of the signals and restarts the counter, so to speak. Let's patch the first output into the scope, and let's use the reference output to patch into one of the 4 inputs here on the top of KNOBI. Now with this big knob here in the left position or counterclockwise, whatever is going on here, whatever you send in here, is getting attenuated completely. If you bring this knob up, you will see that we are getting a readout on the display of 5, which means we're getting 5 volts. This readout represents whatever is coming out of the first output. And you can also see on the scope the line for these 5 volts. This button gives you an additional 5 volts of offset, which you can see on the readout. Well, you cannot see it because my cable is in the way. So there you can see it. This adds another 5 volt to the mixing section here on top. You can also see the 10 volt on the scope. This is a momentary button, so as soon as you release it, you're not getting the 5 volt offset anymore. This big knob here also attenuates this 5 volt offset. Well, this is expected because it's just mixed in at the input stage here. And then the signal goes through to the bottom of KNOBI, and it goes through this attenuverter, which allows you to, well, attenuate the signal. And there's a center indent for this nice knob here. And then when you turn it to the left, the signal is just getting inverted. You can see this on the scope, but you can not see this happening on the readout. This is because the readout is only showing us the positive voltages. So there you go. You can also see that we are getting some nice red glow here under the panel, but also only when there's a positive voltage present. To make sense of the switch here, I'll keep the 5 volt of reference voltage patched up to the input. So right now we're just getting, when we attenuate the signal using this big knob, a signal of 0 to 5 volts. Now if we flick this switch in the upper position, there's a time 2 multiplication which happens before this knob. So we get a 10 volt signal, which we can then again attenuate completely. Now if we should remove the reference voltage and we add the offset with a momentary button, you can once again see that this 5 volt that is just mixed in at the mixing stage gets amplified times 2 with the switch in the upper position as well. Let's reconnect this 5 volts. Now, to make sense of what's happening in the bottom position of the switch, it's probably best to connect a different kind of signal to KNOBI. What the bottom position of the switch is doing, it's amplifying our signal times 2, well, which we again can attenuate with this, but then it adds a negative 5 volt offset, and this might sound a little bit random, but at the end of the video there's a patch example where I make very good use of this setting. So let's go back to the center position for a moment. Let's take input B, because why not? And right now the switch is in the middle position, which means we are not amplifying our signal. The attenuator here is fully open. So what we are getting out of KNOBI is exactly what we are sending in. And you can see on the scope that this is a sine wave LFO that lives between 5 volts and minus 5 volts. Again, 1 square represents 5 volts. So in the top position, just as I showed you before, this sine wave is amplified times 2, which gives us a sine wave that lives between 10 volts and minus 10 volts. We're still just getting a readout in the positive range. We can invert this. The readout happens after everything else. By the way, it happens after the attenuverter. With the switch in the center position, you can still mix in this reference, which, as you will see, just offsets our LFO with 5 volts. This now makes it a strictly positive LFO, which can be useful for modules by certain manufacturers that only accept positive CV voltages. You can also add this 5 volt offset with this momentary switch. By the way, if you don't want a positive LFO but you want a negative one, well, you can add the 5 volts of offset here, and then you can see that our LFO is strictly positive. But when you then invert it using the attenuverter here, you get a strictly negative unipolar sine LFO. So now back to trying to figure out what the bottom position of the switch does. Let's just flick it and see what happens. So now you can see that our LFO is indeed amplified times 2, and the sine wave that's being amplified times 2 is then afterwards getting offsetted with -5 volts. This offset happens after the attenuation here, so when we attenuate the sine wave completely, we still end up with a -5 voltage, which we cannot see on KNOBI, but when we then invert the signal using the attenuverter, well, then suddenly it's very apparent that this 5 volts of offset is there. So if you then bring in the LFO again, with the attenuverter here in the left position, this is now an inverted LFO with a +5 volt offset. Let me briefly switch to an audio rate sine wave so we can at least listen to what's happening for a moment. So there we go. Now the readout on KNOBI, it's a little bit slow. It's calibrated, but as it's suggested in the manual, it's not a scientific precision tool. So don't mind the numbers here. They're just flashing away, looking nice. So this is our bipolar audio rate VCO, which we can attenuate. Maybe I should use a saw wave instead. So here we can see the non-inverted saw wave. We can attenuate it. We can offset it. Please keep in mind that the offset that we are adding with either the momentary switch or just by patching up a reference voltage from here, all of this is getting attenuated by this knob. So to get an actual 5 volt of offset for our VCO, you need this in the right position. So there you can see we're getting a VCO on the scope that's offsetted with 5 volts. Now you won't hear the difference, but for some interfaces this might make a difference, since this DC offset, and that's what it's called, can cause some problems with your mix and with headroom. But well, rest assured, most interfaces and even some mixers filter this DC offset out. If we flick this switch in the upper position, well, just a little warning, this will get louder because, well, this amplifies our signal times 2. In some cases this will of course clip whatever is coming behind it. We can still attenuate towards 0. We can also invert this signal, well, or attenuate. Then past 0 it is inverting our saw wave. You should be able to see this. Right now we're, well, if we would be a skater coming from the left, we have these jumps. But then when I turn this attenuverter to the left, should you then be a skater that comes from the left, well, you have a steep drop and then you're crashing into a wall. So this is a good time. This is a hospital visit. I'm sure you can see the difference, even though there's no difference to how these sound. Then, well, when you keep this in mind, that we're currently having a good time with our skateboard. If I flick this switch in the bottom position, well, we're still having a good time. So this does not invert our signal, this just amplifies times 2, and adds a -5 volt offset. If you want to make this offset positive, we need to invert the signal, which is once again hospital visit stuff of nightmares. But at least we can see that the offset is now positive. So with the switch in the center position, let's just quickly look at the second output here. You can see that this is a signal twice as loud once again. If we flick the switch in the upper position, we already start with a signal that is 2 times as loud as what we are sending in. So this output will give us, well, 2 times that, which is of course hard clipping everywhere. And you can go further. This is times 3 and this is times 4. But what I want to show you is that as soon as you patch something in another output here, normalization or the stacking of these multiples at least is broken. Similarly, if you patch up the times 2, the next one will be just the times 1 again. So all of this is very confusing. Well, maybe it's not so confusing once you understand what's happening. I think the easiest way to understand KNOBI is just thinking about well, the signal chain. We first get a mixing stage. You can mix in whatever you want. There's a hardwired 5 volt offset that you activate by pressing this button. You can patch in your own offset coming from the reference voltage output or from everywhere else in your system. All of this is mixed together. Just at unity gain with the switch in the center position. If we flick it to the top position, we get a amplification times 2. If you flick it to the bottom position, we get an amplification times 2 as well. But then after the attenuation stage, there's a 5 volt offset. And behind that there's an attenuverter that attenuates and inverts the signal. It sends this signal through the readout and out of the first output, and then you get this cascaded or stacked multiple situation. You can use these 4 outputs at the same time. So if you use all 4 of them, they all send out the exactly same signal. At which point you can just look at these as buffered modes. Now, before we go into a few patch ideas, I want to first thank Federico from Jolin for sending me this and a few other nice modules. I think the build quality on these is really nice. I especially like these knobs. These are very, well, they feel very sturdy. I cannot wiggle them even if I tried. And well, the same knobs are used on this mixer here, which is, well, just similarly nice. So let's now listen to a few, well, they're not really just sound examples. I explain the patches in detail, so you can make sense of how you can use all the features on KNOBI a little bit more. Well, at least that's what I hope. But yeah, it's an elaborate volume knob with some kind of offsetting and multiplication. So really what you do with it is, well, it's up to your imagination. So I'm just showing you a few of the things that I came up with this. I hope you enjoy these patches. I have this drone here, which I made with a through zero linear FM oscillator going through a wave folder, and the output of all of that is going through this filter, which is 3 tones Steve MS22, and this is kind of 3 tones take on an MS20 filter. We kept the resonance down because otherwise this would sound like this, which, well, it sounds great, but I want to keep the levels somewhat consistent. Anyhow, I want to be able to open and close this filter without actually having to turn a knob. So to do this I used a KNOBI, or should I say KNOBI, the switch that sets the amount of amplification and attenuation and, well, offset is in the center position. And as I explained earlier, when I press this push button here, there's a 5 volt voltage mixed in the mixing stage. So should I have this switch in the upper position, this would mean that with all the attenuation completely open, this 5 volt here would be multiplied by 2, which means I would end up with a 10 volt output at the ×1 output. But as you probably already saw, I'm using the ×2 output, which also gives me 10 volt when I push this button, even with the switch in the middle position here. Now, because this is a gate, it's very sudden, so I ran the signal from the ×2 through a slew limiter, which you can see here. Now let me turn down the frequency of the filter a bit. And then when I press this button, you will be able to see the output of the slew limiter on the scope. You will see that I get a 10 volt gate, but, well, there's some envelope to it. This will get a little bit louder and of course a lot brighter. And as you can see on the readout, this reads, well, close to 5 volt. But the readout, as I explained earlier, gives us the voltage that's present at the ×1 output. An interesting thing that happens when you run a signal through a slew limiter is that when the signal is not present long enough, and when the slew limiter is set to, well, have a slow rise and a slow fall, you'll notice that when you press it briefly, the output of all of this won't actually reach 10 volts. And this is not because KNOBI is not sending out those 10 volts, it's just because it's going through a slew limiter. And this one hasn't got the time to fully open. But that's exactly what I want for a patch like this. So let's bring in some ambience. Let's turn down this frequency even more. Let's have a look at another type of patch where I use KNOBI as a macro controller for several other modules around my system. For the moment, there's no external voltage going into KNOBI, so to get anything out of it, you have to either press the momentary offset switch or patch the reference output to one of the mix inputs on top here. The switch is in the center position, which means it's not being amplified, but we can attenuate it completely with this knob. There's no residual offset left. That would only happen when we flick this to the bottom position. And because of the way that I have this patch set up, I'll keep the attenuverter to the right here. So let's unmute a sound here. There's a couple of things happening, but the bulk of the sound in this patch is coming from the saw output of even VCO, which is just to the left here. It's running through a filter, which I'm opening and closing now, and also running through beats. Let me mute the beats part of this patch. So that's just the saw output of even VCO going through my synthesis system VCF. I patched up an output of another VCO to the hardsync input of even VCO, and you may or may not know, but when you sync one oscillator to another one, and in this case it's even VCO that's getting synced, at which point we can call it the slave oscillator. In a patch like that, the tuning of your slave oscillator will not really affect the pitch of your sound, but it will affect the timbre. And to change the tuning of even VCO, I patched up the first output of KNOBI. It's going through a zero scope, and it's just going into frequency modulation input on even VCO. And let me just briefly unpatch this second lead here, so we can just hear the timbre change when I turn this knob on KNOBI. So what I'm doing now is just adding an offset represented by the voltage on the readout here, adding an offset to the frequency of even VCO. It just means I'm increasing the pitch, but because it's patched in a hard sync patch, this causes the sound quality to change instead of the perceived pitch. You can press this momentary button here, which adds 5 volt to the mix section, which is also getting attenuated by the settings of the knob, of course. So that's no surprise there that we get this momentary timbre change. I skipped the second output here, and as I explained, these are cascaded multiples, so if you skip one, these get kind of stacked together in the next output. So the third output here, which is, as you can hear, patched through to the frequency of my filter, this output is twice as loud, or well, the amplitude is twice as high as the signal that I'm using for the tuning of even VCO. You should be able to see this on the scope. Well, every square stands for 5 volts. You can see that when the top trace goes up half a square, the bottom trace is already up a whole square. And this also is represented when I press the momentary gate switch. So there we have a timbre change because of the hard sink patch, and also a timbre change because I am running the output of even VCO through a filter, which is getting modulated by KNOBI here. And then we get to the beats part of all of this. So what I did is take the fourth output here, which, because we patched the previous output, is just well, a copy of the ×1. We're not stacking any signals here because I extracted the third one here. So this fourth one is going to beats, which is just being fed with a multiple of the output of my filter. And I'm really just adjusting the pitch of beats. Let me mute my original signal. So you can hear that we are adjusting the pitch of, well, the granular processing. And again with the momentary switch. There is some attenuation happening on beats itself, which causes the pitch shift to be somewhat contained. But when we turn this up completely, well, it goes up quite a bit. So that's the basic patch that I want to start off with. Let's unmute the original signal again. So I think this is already rather interesting. And by patching up several outputs of one controller to, well, different parameters in a patch, you always get unexpected results at certain settings, where there's just a nice interplay between harmonics or pitches. Well, that's always a fun thing to stumble upon. I want to add a little bit of stuff to this patch. Let's start off by connecting. Doesn't really matter that much, but I'll take the fourth output here. And I want to connect this to the trigger input of a kick drum module. Now keep in mind, because I'm working with offsets here, pressing this button, well, I have to unmute my mixer channel. Pressing this button here at this setting will cause the kick to be triggered, but if I increase the voltage here, there's a certain point where I kind of pass the threshold where the kick is calibrated to, so apparently This kick drum module, and I'm using Mandrake by Maelstrom, is calibrated to be triggered when the input signal exceeds like something around 3 volts. Something like that. So once we've surpassed that voltage, pressing this momentary switch, which adds 5 volts to the mix, won't cause the kick drum to be triggered anymore. And this is the case for all modules that well, accept some kind of trigger signal. There's always a threshold that's being set by the manufacturer, at which point a module is actually getting triggered. And as you can see, even now, because we are attenuating the whole mix, which also includes this momentary switch here, even when I add this switch, I'm not surpassing the threshold. So probably when I press it now, as you can see, we get the kick drum. So anyway, that's another thing that you can do with this kind of module. Now, this cable is really annoying me, so let's try to force it out of the frame. No. No, it's not. It wants to be in the video, so well, let's just not hurt its feelings. So that's something that you can add for some kind of performance. Now I want to add a few more things. First of all, let's take the output. Well, I'm taking some output of this delta V, which has both sides on looping, and I've attenuated the levels of these looping envelopes quite a bit on the module itself, but let's run it into KNOBI as well. And this signal is getting mixed in at the mixing stage, which causes an offset to whatever is going on already, and then we get to attenuate it with the big knob. Let's do another thing. I'm connecting a trigger output on the kick drum. This particular kick drum is an envelope output, which I can use to, well, in this case, trigger an 8-step analog sequencer whenever the kick drum itself is getting triggered. This analog sequencer is connected to the master VCO. If you remember, enslaving even VCO to another VCO, and that master VCO kind of takes over, well, it controls the pitch of the patch. So right now, this 8-step sequence, it's getting triggered whenever the kick drum is hitting. Giving us that added variation. And then I want to add one more thing. I have this sine wave LFO set up here to be a little bit randomized by the other side of a dual LFO, which I'm using for this. And I just want to add this to the mix input on KNOBI, which this will cause a drastic change in our patch, because well, it's a very hot signal and it's not getting attenuated beforehand. But well, let's just listen to this. So as you can see and hear, this really takes control of the patch, but well, we have still some fine tweaking that we can do. We're just increasing the big knob here. This is going to be the last patch explanation of this video, but I promised to show you at least one patch where I'm using this switch in the bottom position, which, well, gives us a, well, at first it sounds somewhat random setting of amplifying whatever we send in ×2, and then adding a 5-volt negative offset. But after thinking about it for a while, it hit me that it's really useful when you want to patch up your own sidechain compression. Let me bring in some sounds first. This is a mix of, well, some complex VCO and a bass line. Both sounds are going through a low pass filter, and as you can hear, there's some frequency modulation on this filter. I want to add a kick drum to this patch, which you can see being triggered from the LED here. I'm still just using Mandrake by Maelstrom Audio, and while this sounds okay, the frequencies of the bass drum and our synths are, well, fighting a little bit. This patch would really benefit from having a sidechain compressor for compressing the synths whenever the kick drum hits. Now, I usually use an outboard sidechain compressor, but that's just because it's easier with my outboard mixer. But you really just need KNOBI, some kind of envelope generator, and the VCA. In this patch, I'll just be using the VCA feature on Tutto e Sempre, the mixer module by Jolin, for which I will make a video somewhere in the upcoming days or weeks. A quick side note about tutto e sempre. I don't know how to pronounce this. There's 4 channels that you can use in stereo. There's, well, kind of inserts for every channel. And then, well, amongst other things, there's also inputs for a built-in VCA. There's separate VCAs for both the left and right inputs, but these are normalized together, so you can just get away with using one. I found this mixer to be surprisingly clean, which I really appreciate. I think a mixer should be either really clean or have a lot of character. Anyway, so you can see the kick drum, well, you can still hear it as well. You can hear it thumping away, and I want the synth sound to duck every time the kick drum hits. So first of all, I will use a stackable cable to mult the trigger that's triggering the kick drum. Let's patch it in here. Now, if this cable wants to cooperate, you should be able to see that there's an envelope being triggered there. Let me just set KNOBI, well, set the switch here in the center position and run this envelope through. And I'll run the output. Let's just use the first output into the scope. And it's probably no surprise that we are getting an envelope that's in time with our kick drum. Now you might think that it's sufficient to invert this envelope, send it through to the VCA. But well, if you ever tried patching or a sidechain compressor in eurorack, you probably already figured out that this is not going to work. You're either using a 2-quadrant multiplier, which attenuates the signal completely when you send in negative control voltage, which we are doing now, or you're using a 4-quadrant multiplier as a VCA, which just, well, acts exactly the same when you send in a negative signal. Well, in terms of volume, it does. So this is not what we want. But, well, let KNOBI work its magic. Let's flick this switch in the bottom position, which multiplies the envelope times 2, and it adds a negative 5-volt offset, which, as you can see, causes this kind of shape to happen. So we have an envelope, but there's a negative offset. And what we now want to do is just invert this with the attenuverter on KNOBI. And you will hear that this is what we want. So let me quickly repeat that, because I know I can make things more confusing by talking so very much. So we want to duck our synth. For that we just take the same trigger that we're using for the kick drum. You send it through an envelope. You send the output of the envelope through KNOBI. And you send the output of KNOBI to, well, any kind of VCA will work for this, but I'm just using the built-in VCA on the 4-channel stereo mixer by Jolin. And then to get sidechain compression out of this, all you need to do is flick this switch in the bottom position and invert the signal with the attenuverter. Let's now add some variation to the patch. This is the end of the video about KNOBI. I hope you learned something in this video. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Bye.